everybody. Welcome to day 3 of the Seattle Design Festival virtual main stage. My name is Adrian.
My name is Trevor.
And we'll be your host for today's show.
Tonight's program is going to be the final one, pretty exciting. We've got Dan Heister here to talk about empathy, AIA Seattle Travel Scholarship recipient Queena Stone. He's going to talk about co-housing and the Office of Planning and Community Development, sorry, are going to be talking about conversions of office space to housing.
Yeah, let's get it started. So first up, we have a presentation by Dan Heister, who discusses the importance of cultivating empathy for teammates. Let's take a look.
Hello. Thank you so much for watching this presentation. This is a topic that I've been really excited to talk about for some time, and I'm really happy that you're here. But before we get into it, I want to start by making a confession. When I needed to make an image to help promote this talk, I panicked. How can I create an image about empathy at work? Like, what does empathy at work even look like? Like a picture of people at work smiling? And I immediately thought to myself, no, that's too tacky. And if you make empathy look tacky in front of a bunch of designers, that is game over. Like, we don't want that. So immediately I asked what other images could I use? And the more I tried coming up with good ideas, I kept drawing blanks. So to unblock myself, I tried the next worst thing, AI image generators. And some of the images I generated were really, really interesting. Like this one, like over on the left, that desk seems to have human legs for one of its table legs. Or like, what's going on in the top corner of the room? Like, did someone start working this job after getting cut in half in a magic trick? Or this one, if you look around, you'll see there are so many things going wrong with people's legs. And the faces here are kind of blurry and undefined, like a nightmare scene from Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. But eventually I realized that I wanted to share these images with you because there's a really helpful metaphor here. You see, the way AI image generators work is people train a model by feeding it lots and lots of images of whatever it is they want the model to learn. These particular images were generated using a model that had been trained mostly with isometric renderings of architecture. It hasn't been trained on many images of people, and so the way it sees us is a little off. And that's what I want to talk with you about, because we work like this too. If we are so focused on what we're designing that we never slow down to really see the people working next to us, then the way we see them is going to be a little off. But why does this matter? In design thinking, we hear about having empathy for our users all the time. Why is it important to also have empathy for our coworkers? Well, one reason, there's a lot of stress at work. According to Gallup's annual State of the Global Workplace report, 52% of workers in North America feel daily stress about work. We're actually tied with East Asia for the most daily stress in the world. And I think cultivating empathy can both make you less stressed out, but also make you less stressful for others. One time I heard a restaurateur named Arya Weinsweig say something like, when you start to feel furious, get curious. And I really love that phrase because curiosity can be a powerful tool to help us be more empathetic to the people around us. Another good reason is that it can help the psychological safety where you work. Study after study shows that teams where employees report having psychological safety at work frequently deliver more innovative work than teams that don't. And we're designers. We don't want to do the same old thing. We want opportunities to do innovative work, right? In March 2022, Harvard Business Review published a study showing that teams that were both diverse and also reported feeling psychologically safe are more likely to deliver results. There have been other studies showing that the best designs often have input from people with very different backgrounds. But if the team doesn't have a sense of psychological safety, then dysfunction often negatively impacts the team and the quality of the finished work. This graph here shows you two things. One, that teams with high psychological safety generally perform better than those without it. And two, most teams don't have high psychological safety. That Gallup report I mentioned earlier also says that only 31% of workers in North America are what they would call engaged. Now, they measure engagement from a survey where they ask employees questions like, do you have the opportunity to do what you do best every day? Do you feel that someone at work cares about you as a person? Does someone at work encourage your development? And I want to flip some of these questions on you. Do you make your coworkers feel that you care about them as a person? Do you know if your coworkers are doing what they do best? If they were constantly getting tasked with something that isn't what they do best, would you know that? This number, 31%, means that more than 2/3 of the living, breathing, feeling people at work right now aren't thriving or don't feel supported. And I've looked at this report for the last several years. It's always in this neighborhood. Now, I'm not saying that your empathy by itself is going to magically make this number jump up, but what I am saying is, when the number is consistently this low, there's a good statistical chance someone you work with can benefit from a little empathy. Finally, one of the best reasons for empathy for our coworkers is empathy doesn't come to us as naturally as we want. It's not like a salt shaker. Like, it isn't just simple to add some empathy. I think a lot of us are really uncomfortable with saying this out loud because it might sound like we're admitting that we're unkind or that we're complaining that we're a victim. And empathy at work is emotional labor, and that is often very difficult. So if there's a really big need for empathy at work and it doesn't come as naturally as we want, what can we do? First, I want to talk about some of the things that make it challenging for us and give those challenges a name so that we're equipped with the words to talk about them. And second, I'll suggest some strategies to help you face some of these challenges, cultivate some curiosity, and nurture empathy. But before we really dive into it, I want to encourage you on two things. I don't want you to dwell on other people's actions while you're thinking through this. It's often much, much easier for us to see a gap in empathy from others than it is to see it in ourselves. And that's natural. But one thing I've noticed is if we think about this as revealing insights about how frustrating other people are, that tends to stop us from focusing on our own sense of empathy. And also, don't be too hard on yourself. None of us are perfect. Empathy for yourself means seeing your shortcomings as an opportunity to grow towards the best version of yourself. Now, I'm not here to judge you. This is hard, but it's worth it. So let's dive in and start with a question. Do you notice that little details can turn into weirdly big disagreements? If you pay close enough attention, you may notice that we get weird about making decisions when there's work to get done. And there are a lot of decisions we make at work that we would make differently at home. I personally think one factor that contributes to this is that our work is our livelihood. It's a core component of our individual survival. So to talk about this idea, let's give that a name. Some psychological researchers have used the phrase threat rigidity to describe situations where we become inflexible or more easily agitated when we are in a situation where we feel threatened. And when design work is our livelihood, there are so many unexpected things we might perceive as threats. It can come from a sudden change in direction in the project, or negative feedback, or even feedback that's like 80% positive, but has a few suggestions about how to do something differently. And this rigidity often undermines our ability to think carefully about our work. But if we feel like something we experience at work is a threat, it might start a fight or flight response. That is a temporary physiological change where more oxygen is released towards our bodies so we can physically fight off something or run away from it. And our minds naturally tend to narrow our focus onto a really specific part of the threat. And this may not be an appropriate response for the things that may happen in a day at the office, but this is how we are evolved to respond to perceived threats. And also, work is loaded with stimuli for implicit biases. These are illogical or unhealthy patterns of thoughts that are often a reaction to a certain stimulus we experience out in the world. Many psychologists believe that these are rooted in the evolution of our species, so we're all prone to them. Implicit bias is the umbrella term for biases relating to us perceiving somebody else as being different from ourselves. So those are things like gender or race or age or weight or the way someone dresses or what somebody's job is or what department they work in or where they grew up or how they talk. The list goes on and on and on. And all of these factors can get in the way of us seeing that person for who they really are. And there's a specific name for a bias where you trust someone more if they have the same job or work in the same department, and then trust someone less if they don't have the same job or don't work in the same department. That one is called in-group bias. And this relates to work because companies often break their workforce down into groups, right? Like we all have titles. Many of us have teams or departments, oftentimes walls between those teams or departments. How many of us have heard stories or like noticed times where designers get together to talk about non-work stuff and like they trust the recommendations from other designers more than someone who doesn't have designer in their title? Or at a big enough company, have you heard stories where, let's say, Team Orange talk about how their work is really great, but those designers on Team Purple, they're doing everything wrong? Like, this is in-group, out-group bias. And it's not a problem for just designers. Like there are examples of this happening for just about every group of people that you can think of. So without really meaning to, we've collectively designed work to have groups, which then inherently carries a risk of setting off our in-group bias. And there's no easy workaround for that, right? Like it's not realistic to say, like, I'm just going to avoid people from different departments for the rest of my life. Like that would be ridiculous, right? But after in-group bias, there are a bunch of other ones. Actually, a lot of other ones. And I think for most of these, the name speaks for themselves, but this isn't even a full list. It's really just a start. And if you think that you have fallen into one of these, my point here is not to shame you. If you're still listening and you still want to be here, you're doing great. But what I want you to reflect on is each of these biases is a stumbling block for a lot of us. But giving each of these a name then gives us a way to think about it and strategize about it. So let's talk about some tools to help us cultivate some empathy in spite of all of these challenges. If you think about that list, you can challenge yourself to see all of those factors as something to be curious about. Gender often affects how a person experiences work, or race, or age. Really, you live in a world that is full of people who aren't exactly like you because they aren't literally you. So one place to start is to see each of those biases as an opportunity to be curious. Now, as you're following this curiosity, try to avoid asking creepy questions. There are a lot of people who don't really like questions that start with, as a blank, how does this affect you? But if someone who is different from you in one of those ways opens up about their experiences and perspective, treat that perspective as a gift, because mindfully accepting that gift can help you push back against those biases and nurture your empathy for where they're coming from. Another strategy that I like is when you're interacting with someone who has a different job from you, think about how their job is defined. This was an idea that I got from a book called Articulating Design Decisions by Tom Griever. Ask yourself questions like, what is the goal of their job? How does that goal connect to their sense of livelihood? when you talk about the goals you're trying to accomplish in your design work, can you maybe speak to the goals of their job? And if you don't know what the goal of their job is, maybe you know someone you can safely ask about. Years ago, a workshop presenter asked me if I know how the stuff I work on every day ultimately does something to deliver value to my employees, customers. And in the moment, I answered no. But that proved to be a major light switch turning on moment for me, because it made me realize that my work isn't the final deliverable or the final product to the customer, but my work is one of the steps that shapes that final deliverable, along with the work of others. Once you understand how your work helps to shape that final deliverable, you can start to ask questions like, how can I do my work in such a way that I set up the next person in their job for success? Or how can I talk with people who work in other roles about how they can do their job in such a way that it sets me up for success? And by success, I'm not talking about individual greatness here. I am talking about successfully contributing to the shape of the product so that it delivers something of value to the customer. If you can concentrate in ways that you both set each other up for success, then that helps you to approach each other's work in a more empathetic way. And here's another idea that I got from a book called Crucial Conversations. Separate facts from stories. Our brains often make sense of the world by taking the facts that we see and then filling the gaps with stories. And then we internalize those stories. So when you start to get upset or irritable, try to play a detective. Out of all the things that you're thinking about, which ones are the verified facts and which parts of this are the story that we might be using to fill the gaps between the facts? Once you identify what parts are the story, challenge yourself to think about an alternate version of the story where the other person means well. Some people call this ascribing positive intent. Now, I'm not saying that everyone is going to have positive intent, but I am saying that ascribing positive intent as a thought exercise can help make you a more impartial judge of what is happening around you. And I also think that ascribing positive intent makes it easier for you to be more empathetic to that other person's position. Another helpful tool is a casual one-to-one. This is a part of my process for working with people in general. Anytime I start a new job, or if a new person is brought into a team that I'm working with, I make a point of inviting that person to meet casually. It could be for coffee or going out to lunch, something like that. And I'll start that conversation by saying, I want to ask you first about your journey. How did you get here? And if you have time after that, I'd also like to talk about what you're working on now, what you think is working well, and what you are working to do differently. A lot of the time, we kind of spend most of that conversation just talking about the journey, and that's okay. But during their story, I like to ask a lot of thoughtful questions, and I want to encourage you to ask some of these questions as well. Questions like this help to show that you're interested, but it comes with a cool bonus, because putting thought into your questions can help you learn how to be more curious and more interested in others. One of my favorite questions to ask as a coworker shares their journey is, how did that experience change your perspective? Or put another way, how did that experience change the way that you look at work? How did it change the way that you want to do your work? Another question that I sometimes ask is, does this connect back to that earlier story? This can help them articulate the continuity in their journey so that you don't make assumptions about how they got here. But some people enjoy the opportunity to do this self-reflection because we often get so focused on the here and now that we don't slow down to connect the dots in our own life stories. Now, during this conversation, you may notice there is some overlap between their journey and your journey. If they've worked on something that's really similar to something that I've worked on in the past, then I like to bring up my past project, and I might talk about how I felt about it or what I learned, and then I'll ask them if they see their project in a similar way. Another cool thing you can do with overlap is If you both find you have a shared interest, then you can talk about, is there potential to help each other with that shared interest? You may not be able to actually help them with that today, but you can at least say, like, if a chance to help with this comes up later, I'd be really excited to help you with that. Throughout this conversation, stay really curious. Sometimes you're going to find this overlap, and sometimes you won't, and that's okay. The important thing is that you've invested in the foundation of a relationship with this person. And that will give you some ideas about how to work with them more effectively and have more empathy for who they are. And they may have some better ideas about you too. Now, I could probably go on about this all day, but we need to start to wind this down. So I want to start an exercise. I want you to pull out a piece of paper if you have it, or maybe a note-taking app on your phone, or start writing an email to yourself. And I'll give you a minute to do that. And I want you, now that you have this piece of paper in front of you or an email, I want you to ask yourself the question, what makes your job uniquely challenging? What is something about your job that makes it hard work, but somebody probably wouldn't understand that it's hard work if they don't have hands-on experience actually doing your job? And then the second question that I want you to think about and write down an answer to is, how might someone with a different job than you help you with this problem? What is something that you think someone can do that would make a positive impact on this aspect of your job? Just give that a minute and think about a way that someone could realistically help. So now that you have something written down, what do you think? Did writing this challenge you to think about how someone could help? And now that you've done this exercise, like, is this something that you would want to try with somebody else? So to conclude, thank you for listening. This is often an uncomfortable topic, but facing uncomfortable parts can be part of how we grow. And I really hope these strategies that I've mentioned help you to be more curious and to be more empathetic towards people who work next to you.
Hey, welcome back. Thank you, Dan, for that lovely talk about empathy. I feel more empathetic already.
Oh, yeah. A lot of great tips he shared. All important things to do, right?
Yes, yeah. We all need more empathy. What's coming up next?
Yeah, next up is a video fully produced by SDF volunteers where they went out and asked people questions relating to this year's theme, curiosity. So let's take a look.
Design can be art, can be anything you want. It can be from a structure to an art piece, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense, but anything that is a kind of a representation of creativity. Yeah.
To me, design is very physical. Like when I think of design, I think about it as something that happens in physical space, and it doesn't only do that, but I know that that's where my brain will go. Yeah, so when I think about designing, for example, a set, I'm thinking about how are things arranged in physical space? How is that telling a story? Is that the story that you want to tell?
To me, design, well, it encapsulates many things. It starts with inspiration, and sometimes it starts with purely function. and it's blending of those two. Performance design, there's a body that's going to be wearing it. It has to do certain things and look beautiful. Yeah, it's so many things. I mean, even once you learn all the components like scale, silhouette, form, it's still a very spiritual, artistic expression.
That is a large question. Something I realized years ago is it's a lot about taste, which I don't think was something that I was ever told. I just was working on a project and came to the realization that it's very much about my taste and the director's taste and the writer's taste, producer's taste, and about, as far as theater goes, trying to hopefully be in a world or in a situation where all of that lines up appropriately to create whatever is the best version of the show or the best version of my work in the show.
Procrastinate, walk away. I think if I'm working on like 6 projects at a time, which is probably true, when I get stuck on one project, I get so much good work done on the other 5. So I think I just have recognized that blocks are part of the process, and sometimes you do just need, and beneficial in that way, that like when you're blocked on one thing, it sometimes frees you up to work on other things. And sometimes freeing myself up to work on those other things allows me to come back to the first one and see it with new eyes, and I'm usually a little bit closer to the deadline, so there's a little bit more fire under me.
Those are my 2 primary touch points, is what was the inspiration? Was it a color palette? Was it something from nature? I did a show where the inspiration was tree bark. By the time it gets to stage, I might be the only person that knew the inspiration was tree bark. So that's one challenge, and it has to be used in the performance. So it has to be performer friendly. It has to speak to whatever their design is, because theatrical design and performance design, it's not just my vision. If it was just my vision, I would be in fashion, and it would have to fit a perfect size 10 body. It doesn't have to do anything but look fantastic. While in theater or performance, it really is supporting somebody else's vision. So that's the best, supporting somebody else's vision. It's very collaborative, but just different than visual design or graphic design, painting, textile design. It doesn't have to fit anyone. So what we do has to work with the performer.
The bad answer is procrastinate. The good answer is research the hell out of it. I specifically I'm thinking of one show that the director wanted to use cool jazz, and at that time I knew almost nothing about it, so I just went and got a whole bunch of cool jazz and just spent a week just listening and listening and listening. And gradually by the end of it, even though I wouldn't say I understand cool jazz, I at least was able to understand enough of it to understand what parts might work well for that show.
I work collaboratively, so I don't think I know that it works unless everybody else thinks it works too. But just because other people think it works doesn't mean that I think that it works. It needs to be both. There's so many different ways to interpret that question, because I think about like reviewers, right? So sometimes I have had the kind of show where reviewers love the set so much that that's all they talk about. And I actually feel like that might have been a failure on my part, because I did such a good job telling the story with this space that I didn't leave room for the performers. I mean, I think at its root, probably the most important thing is that there is an inside of me voice that says, I believe in this makes sense to me, and it stands up to my own analysis, and my collaborators are also on board with it.
I have a handful of projects that have reaffirmed why I love doing it. So satisfying. The director, the performers, myself, the lighting designer, the scenic elements just came together, and it's like hearing angels sing. It's like, this is beautiful. That's not the regular occurrence. It is actually work, but those handful of times that it really worked divinely is why I keep doing it.
Taste. It's somewhat intuitive, I would say, unfortunately. And I say unfortunate because that's a hard thing to teach. But there are certain things that, you know, you can just feel the rhythm is right, or like the mood is right. You know, there's certain sound that, like, the way it'll carry out of a scene just works correctly. Or like if I'm working on a sound effect, then I'll imagine what it is that I'm looking for. But then I have to go and see if I can find that sound. A lot of times it's like, no, I can't find exactly what I'm hearing, but I found this other thing that's close.
I was forced to take a design class in undergrad. I didn't know if I wanted to be an art major. I think I ended up being an art minor. So you had to take design like 1 and 2, and you had to take drawing 1 and 2, and I think you had to take like 1 painting class. And this was just a minor. And I had no idea what design was, like what that would be as a class. So freshman year, I end up in this design class. And it was just about like caring about composition. I'd been able to respond to like liking things or not liking things, but it gave me a whole different language to be able to respond to the work that I liked and to be able to analyze the work that I liked. And in retrospect, probably really changed who I was as an artist, because it gave me this other way that is not just like instinctual, like from the heart response, but this really formalized way, not of judging a piece, but just of like identifying why it might be working, why it might not be working. And then when I learned about theater design just a couple years later, I started learning how those things were also tied to storytelling, and how the way that something looks makes us feel a certain way. And sometimes that's beneficial.
I just have always just done it. There was a community center, I think I was 6 or 7. They were doing a little theatrical performance. I got into the play and I ran home and made a paper mache elephant. In my 6-7-year-old mind, it was a beautiful paper mache elephant. I wish I could really see what that looked like. There was not an elephant in the piece we were doing. And they were very gracious. I don't know if my elephant got on stage. But there's like anything. It's like I like making things out of completely recycled things or things we have on hand. I call that freestyling, when it's got to be in this building and we're going to do it.
I guess college is when I first became aware of it. There have been like moments where I was very conscious of design. Like I can remember going to see Twister, the movie Twister, hearing tornado sounds, then hearing what I thought was like, well, that sounds like an animal. And then I actually read an article, and just happened to be in a newspaper that talked about how they had used like tigers and lion growls or something like that to help make it the tornadoes feel that much more aggressive and threatening. And I was like, oh, that is a design choice.
Yes. Yeah, anybody can be a designer. Like I said, I think it is ultimately just about like caring. There's always a designer, right? We do all these shows sometimes where they're just like, oh, there's just like some actors are putting on a scene. There's still a designer. They are still designing the thing. They are making choices about where the chairs go and what direction they face and which chairs they use, and all of those are design decisions. So designing is just about caring, paying attention to what the choices are that you're making.
Absolutely. But it's predisposition, just like some people are naturally gifted at painting or drawing or running or any creative expression. I can learn to run, but I'm probably never gonna be in a marathon. So my body is not the highly honed machine a marathon runner is. I like it when people just do it and don't worry about, is it good enough? Do I know what I'm doing? You might not know what you're doing, just go for it.
Absolutely, anyone can be a designer. Whether or not you're a good designer, no, but I mean, that is up to trial and error. And but anybody could do it. All they have to do is just try.
Welcome back to the Center for Architecture and Design. The party's getting going. Speaking of Center for Architecture and Design, our hosts are Seattle Architecture Foundation, but it also houses AIA Seattle, who gives out a travel scholarship every year. And I believe our next presentation is from someone who won that scholarship. Adrian, you know more.
Yeah, Queena Stone gave a great presentation on it where she discusses senior co-housing as an option, as an alternative option to current senior housing options out there in our states right now. So, yeah, let's take a look.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to start with my introduction. So this presentation was brought to you by AIA Seattle's Emergency Professional Travel Scholarship. I was awarded the travel scholarship back in 2020, and then the pandemic hit, and therefore I was not able to do the travel, obviously. And then I revisited the project in the beginning of this year in January, where I started my travel and the research. And the whole topic of this presentation is about senior co-housing as an alternative to current senior housing options that we have in the States, but then also looking at European models as a role model to how we can do things differently in the States. So the presentation outline is how I'm going to structure the conversation. So firstly, it's an overall of the scholarship and an introduction to senior co-housing and summary of each of the communities I visited and how COVID impacted senior co-housing projects and communities, and looking at briefly senior LGBTQ co-housing solutions that exist currently and that some that are on their way. And then some of the major takeaways that I have from this project, and then just wanting to thank the participants and then providing you with some of the resources that I had found during my journey through this project. Okay, so how I became curious about senior co-housing. So on the right of the screen, you'll see it was about 5 years ago, there was a really big pandemic of Japanese elderly women who were single because their husbands had passed away, and traditionally the elder woman would be at home when the husband would go to work, and so there weren't a lot of established communities or relationships that they would have. And so what's been happening in Japan is a lot of elderly women are incredibly lonely, and when their husbands pass, they don't have that network of friends to have conversations with. And so what they've been doing is committing small petty crimes so that they can go to prison. And in prison, they find refuge because they're no longer alone. And when I found out this was happening in Japan, I just was completely shocked and felt that there had to be some better solutions out there for an aging population. And of course, Japan is a little bit ahead of us. A lot of countries are going to be facing this issue. The Japanese community is just a lot more elderly than in other countries. And then on the left, I was working at a firm where I did a lot of senior co-housing projects, and you'll see these renderings here. And then at the bottom, you'll see some interior renderings. And when I look at these projects and the cost of living at these projects, I just feel like that's not something that we could tolerate with regards to how we treat our senior citizens. And I really firmly believe that the way a society treats their elderly is a reflection of their values. And if we have these fancy homes that cost $6,000-7,000 a month to live in, and that's just with a senior living that does not account for assisted living or memory care. And the design directive that I've been given when I was working on these projects is that you have to make them as Instagrammable as possible. And most senior citizens I know of don't use Instagram. So it's just sort of like this disconnect of what developers are building for seniors with regards to what seniors actually want and need. So this is a map of where I went on my project, and the methods I used was I researched each community. Each community I visited was the first senior co-housing project in their city, and that's relevant because they were the first. They had jumped over many of the hurdles to get something like co-housing developed and and came into fruition. So then I went and did a site visit, and then I had conversations where I had interviewed community members about what they liked about the architecture, what they struggled with community. And this is what you'll be hearing for the next few slides. The first one was in London. It was called Ouch, the older women's co-housing community. They are now called New Ground Housing. It's in High Barnet, which is North London. And then in Paris, the Baba Yaga House, which is also in a suburb called Montreux. And then afterwards came back to the United States and visited Phoenix Commons in Oakland, California, and then PDX Commons in Portland, Oregon. And then lastly, went very locally to Quimper Village in Port Townsend. So what is senior co-housing anyways? It adheres to 6 essential principles. Future residents participate in the design. There are extensive common facilities. Projects are completely owner managed. They are also designed to facilitate community. There's no hierarchy in decision making, and there's no shared economy beyond what it takes to create the project. And just to note that this project does not reference anything but active seniors. It's not intended to explore the needs of seniors requiring assisted living or memory care. Okay, benefits of social housing. You'll receive social support in the sense that you'll get a sense of community and support from the older adults that you live with. Residents tend to share at least 2 meals a week, and they share activities and companionship at the facility. Reduce living costs. It can be a little bit more affordable because you're sharing things as opposed to living in your own single family home. You're sharing services like kitchen, laundry room, parking at common areas. And then you have access to other amenities that would additionally cost you other money, for example, gym, pool, going to the library. And it also provides a sense of safety and security in the sense that you always know where your neighbors are and where they know where you are, and so there's no concern about you not being seen, for weeks on end, and that provides a very solid sense of safety and security. Disadvantages of senior co-housing, however, can be a lot of meetings and a lot of decision making, which requires you to be very active in your community and stay active in the sense that you are considered like a board of a director where you are making decisions for the entire community. And at times, because people are people and you can't always agree with everybody, there will be issues where you have to sometimes have conflict resolutions, and this can sometimes lead to conflicts between residents, but in general, there's usually a policy that a senior co-housing community will adopt to address these issues. But overall, senior co-housing can provide a lot of benefits as opposed to living in your own home or in a different senior facility. And it's really just important to weigh the pros and cons for you personally to understand what would best fit your needs and your personality. Also, just to say that loneliness is one of the biggest issues that a lot of seniors in our society tend to deal with. And, there's been a lot of recent studies out there that basically talk about how loneliness is really so bad for our health that it could be the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It can help advance heart disease, cancer, and mental illnesses, etc. And so living in senior co-housing has definitely shown to be beneficial with regards to delaying things like dementia, delaying hospitalization and mental illness and things like that. Okay, so the first co-housing community that I visited was New Ground, and here are some of the stats. It has 25 units, 17 leaseholds, which in English is just it's a mortgage that you have, and then 8 is social renters. In England, social renters are subsidized by social communities that are responsible to provide social housing for low income residents. And they vary between 1 to 2 and 3 bedrooms. Some of the issues with co-housing, though, however, can be how long it takes to develop. And so, for example, this community took about 18 years. It was completed in 2016, and the minimum age is 50, and they range from 58 to 86. The architect of this project, Patrick Delphin, was very essential with regards to how he worked with the community of women to participate in workshops to really help them drive the design. And some of the financing models you see here is that they had a mixture of housing associations, social housing grants, and trusts, and a very great partnership with Hanover Association. So here you'll see some of the elements of the design that the women really helped participate with. At the lower right, lower left corner, you'll see some of the workshops they held with the architect at the firm's office, where they discussed their values and what they wanted to see within the architecture. One of which, in this middle picture here, you'll see the size of their very generous balconies that each unit has on the upper levels. And then this really interesting element, which really helped with during the COVID pandemic, was these windows that looked into the kitchen area, but all the way through the unit, so that people could connect, even though they didn't physically connect, but could have visual connection when people were isolating during the pandemic. The next is Baba Yaga House, and this was an interesting co-housing project in the sense that it took a very long time as well, 15 years, but it was started by a feminist, Therese Clark, who back in the 70s was a very prominent feminist. And what she basically did was went to the French government and convinced them to fund the project by literally doing the numbers. She basically said, this is how much it's going to cost the French government if each of these women lived separately on their own and later aged in their own place, where you would have to fund the care of these women individually. However, if you built this co-housing project for us, we would take care of each other, thereby reducing the strain on the social welfare and healthcare state. Lower right here, you'll see the rendering. So here are the drawings, the elevations and plan that you'll see, and the section on the bottom left. They were very private with regards to their units, and so I was not really able to share too much about the individual units, but I will say that they are a bit small. It's a pretty suburban but urban neighborhood. They're all studios, and if I go back to the stats, you'll see that 25 units in total on the property, 21 designed for the elderly, and then they actually have 4 ground level studios that are reserved for students. As of late, the Baba Yaga 6-story still accommodates 21 women, 7 of them which are still the original members of the community. These studios down here are made for students that they have come and live, and the students are required to assist with the community with regards to anything that they need in terms of the women need help with technology or fixing something that is part of the inexpensive rent that the students receive. Here you'll see the colored elevations of the project as well. Okay, thirdly, I visited PDX Commons in Portland, Oregon. This one was unique in that the community had reached out to professionals to assist them with this idea of this senior co-housing community. And with that, they hired Urban Development Partners, which is a developer, and they were the ones that secured the site and also had access to the architects, which was work process architecture. And so in a way, it really facilitated the fruition of this community, and thereby allowing this community to have a lot of input and say with regards to how this place is designed, what their values were, and how does that play out in the architecture. As of note, you'll see these nodes here, and these were very significant with regards to how the community was able to get together during the pandemic and allowed to visit without going into each individual's um, unit. And then here you'll see this is their main center, which is their kitchen and main dining space. This is what they call the living room. It's the first thing you see when you walk in, the street view. And then they also have a rooftop garden where they grow a lot of vegetables. I came in the winter, so that's why it doesn't look like that too much. But there's also a barbecue and a nice view from the rooftop. And on the right here, you'll see a list of their multitude of um, amenities. It is also an urban fabric, so one of the things that have been a concern is security, but they're doing things to address that. I will point out that they have this really awesome dog washing station next to their bike station. Okay, so the next one is the Phoenix Commons. Phoenix Commons was also driven by a developer, Christian Zimmerman of Elder Village Development. The interesting element about this developer is that he predominantly um, does projects that are surrounding elderly care and memory care and assisted living. And so he was very familiar and was curious about co-housing and developing a senior co-housing project, and was able to connect with a community that was willing to work with him and create this really beautiful modern project in Oakland, California. It's also adjacent to Alameda, California, which is a small community that's more on the affluent side. Um, and you could see part of the project connected one part of Oakland's outdoor amenity space with this really beautiful long trail that has become a public amenity. Here are images of the courtyards, which was also very beneficial during the pandemic, where they were able to gather outside and have a share lunch. Another thing they did during the pandemic was they came out and sang happy birthdays and things like, and had dance parties. And so it was the architecture that really facilitated the community in multiple ways. Here you'll see another view of that and more of the water. This is a typical unit that's on the top level. The top level had, I think it was, I think 13 feet high ceilings, very quite high ceilings, and then a view of their dining space and their kitchen space, which had a mixture of domestic and industrial equipment to feed the community. And then they also had, as part of their amenity space, an exercise room with a sauna outside, and an area for if there was needs for a nursing room that was also provided in their main space. This is just a typical floor plan on the top floor. You'll see a rendering here and a rendering of the floor plan. Again, another list of the community spaces. Each of these community rooms that I visited in the States also had guest rooms, and that way your unit alone did not have to be so big. But if you wanted guests, you could rent out or borrow the shared rental guest rooms for your guest, which was very convenient. And I also stayed at Phoenix Commons guest room as a guest so that I could be and live amongst the community members for a couple of days, which was really beneficial. And last but not least, Quimper Village. So Quimper Village was something that initially wasn't a part of my original proposal, but after having gone to the other communities, had realized that every project I visited was urban. I really wanted to have an example that was of more of suburban project. This one is called Quimper Village. It's in Port Townsend, Washington, and was also designed by Mike Durant Architects, who has written many books about senior co-housing and the co-housing movement. And his designs are sort of modeled after the Copenhagen Danish co-housing model. So it's not a very it's not focused on a very modern but more cottage-like feel with regards to the architecture. On the bottom here, you see their main house, which is their main dining space, and the entry here, which is very different from the ones that I visited in the urban environments. Is the first thing that you see is you'll see a series of garages, as opposed to the architecture of the housing units itself. You have to kind of go into the site a little bit further before you are uh, faced with the living units. Some examples of the the common spaces. So the laundry, their dining space. This is the entry to their common house, their kitchen. Along the paths, which the paths sort of connect each of the housing units, there are these beautiful landscaping that each of the community members help with maintaining. And they also have these guest units as well as a workshop, and they also have an art room, which I do not have a photo of, but it's really quite nice. And I put the floor plans up here too because again, these units, these cottages are quite different from the other communities that I had visited. They're much larger, being suburban, the smallest one being 910 square feet and the largest being 1335. They're generous. They're high. They all have high ceilings. They're all very much designed with universal design in mind, uh, being that they all are single floor, no stairs, and flat levels to all of the programmed spaces. So some of the common threads, as I had mentioned some of these already, but just wanting to reiterate that because my project was postponed by the COVID pandemic, I really wanted to look at how co-housing facilitated or not facilitated the the sheltering in place and what did it do to the amount of loneliness and that sense of community that they tend to have in general. So there has been some studies from the Journal of Aging and Environment, and they have founded that um, it that more people in senior co-housing environments felt that they had their still mutual support and that they felt better there than where they lived previously. And almost every single person surveyed felt that living in a co-housing project would be much better than having lived in their own single family house that they previously lived in. Um, Here are some quotes from some of the people in the communities that I visited. COVID also illustrated to some community members that were not sure if co-housing were right for them, that it sort of facilitated or advanced their decisions to leave because they didn't enjoy the requirements of the community where it was more about community first before individual rights. And so it was the people that felt like they did not want to be told what to do that ended up leaving the community and new people coming in, which I understand to be was a good thing and not necessarily a bad thing. And another one from a Phoenix Commons member, which said, we weren't alone, we were just isolated. And so that notion of loneliness, as it persuaded in much of the society at the time, just didn't exist as much as it did for these senior co-housing community members. Touching on co-housing and LGBTQ seniors, as you can imagine, as we all grow, and many of us, don't get married, don't have children, don't have a support family. This is really prevalent amongst the LGBTQ community, especially the elderly, the existing elderly community, because they had started off in the 70s and grown older now, and a lot of them did not at the time have the opportunity to get married and to start families. And so this is a predominant population that really needs this type of assistance and needs this type of community to help facilitate their aging and the issues around their aging of loneliness and isolation in this older LGBT population. So when I was in the UK, and this is one of the benefits of being a recipient of the travel grant, is Patrick Delphin, the architect of New Ground, introduced me to Tonic and also the elder lesbian co-housing community. So these different projects are all in their different stages, and they all have different models. And so older lesbian co-housing is just starting up. Well, they've been around for a few years, quite frankly, but they've been struggling with finding a financing model and a site that they can afford in an area of London that they would like to live in. And so that's in a process of them still seeking those two things. Village Hearth Co-housing in Durham, North Carolina, has been around for a while and was also designed by Durant, the, uh, the the same architect that had worked on Crimper Village. Tonic is a very unique model in the sense that it was a community that got together and wanted to live together and wanted to be community led. But what the difference between them and other co-housing projects, because it's not necessarily a co-housing project, even though they do establish their grounds as well, is that instead of doing all of the work themselves, which much of the senior co-housing projects do, they were given the assistance of a board and a CEO, and these people on the board and the CEO went after the funding, went after the site, and they sort of got super lucky and found a project that was designed by Norman Foster in London and was able to just move in. And they moved in because the project already had all the wish list items that they were looking for in a new project for them for that community. So they just got really lucky. And my hope is that people will look at these projects uh, and reach out, learn from what they've learned so far, and start their own LGBTQ senior co-housing projects. Okay, so my takeaways and overall observations is that the funding challenges impacts of the model that the community ex, uh, goes after and uses to build their site really has an impact on their impact of the design. Um, Again, the example I mentioned earlier is the Baba Yaga House, and having it be government funded, they've lost their community center. In Phoenix Commons, for example, though, the community did not have a lot of input with regards to how they wanted to utilize the architecture. One of the women that I spoke with, she loves using the stairs because that's how she gets her exercise every day. One of the things she just doesn't really appreciate is the stair from the parking level to the ground level. So this image over here on the left is the upper level stairs, and then the one on the bottom is the parking level stairs. And it's her least favorite thing to do, but she still does it because she wants that exercise. So something like this could have been easily uh, addressed during a design phase with the community, where you lay out your values and you lay out your wants and needs, and had that participation happen, maybe this situation might not necessarily be there. So how you fund your project and how it gets designed impacts your later happiness and satisfaction with living in your community. Another element and takeaway is hiring professionals. A lot of times people form a community thinking, oh, how hard could it really be? And one of the lessons that I've learned from these communities is that if you hire a knowledgeable team early on, it makes a huge difference with regards to how fast you are able to develop your project and community, and the efficiency of the process, and how well the process becomes a seamless one. There's a lot of people, a lot of developers that are out there that have experience, and so it's just finding the right team to help facilitate what your community's values are. Um, Affordability. When I initially started this project, I really thought that this would be a lot more inexpensive than the current offerings for senior housing. And it isn't to say that it isn't, but you do have to have equity up front to be a part of and to join many of these communities. And hopefully sometimes something like that will maybe change in the future. Um, Building community. So building the building is the easy part, right? So building the community is the hard part, which also comes from a PDX Common member. direct quote. And that being said, you know, there's a lot of focus on getting the project done, finding the site, getting the architect, building the units, and then moving in. And a lot of people think that sometimes that's the end of it. But what the communities have been finding out is um, the bigger charge is really to work to learn how to build a community to where it becomes a well-oiled machine and you function really well and as a contained community, and you support each other and grow together and, you know, evolve as the community evolves. um, Another item that every community was facing that I find really interesting, and because they did sort of come around the same time frame, was that aging in community has become a challenge and a task. Each community had focused on creating a focus group that would look at these issues. And so many times communities will bring in um, people to do workshops, speakers. They'll have, you know, conversations around the topic of death and dying or growing old, or looking at the first signs of Alzheimer's and what does that look like and what or which the next step be. And so it's an ongoing conversation. There's not one community that really knows the right solution. And I think that that's something that each community has to figure out for themselves and their own values and their own members and what does that actually look like. Um, I will say though that the LGBTQ community, Tonic has in the same building a 24-hour emergency health services that was a part of the agreement to move into that structure. So there are a lot of options. I think what it's going to take is just looking at what people are doing and how that might fit your co-housing community. Um, Second to last is participation. A lot of people look at that word and say, I know what that means for me, but what does that mean for you? And in so that sense, you know, what makes a successful senior co-housing community is the level of participation that each community member brings and provides. And that community only is successful when people participate. Um, and lastly, meetings, meetings, meetings. If you don't like meetings, you don't want to live in a co-housing community, because co-housing communities is all about getting together, coming to consensus, having agreement, and moving forward as a community, knowing that you all have come to the agreement of how to move forward as a community. So I just wanted to thank everybody, specifically AIA Seattle, New Ground, Baba Yaga House, Phoenix Commons, PDX Commons, Cremper Village, Tonic, especially CEO Anna Kerr, and the London Older Lesbian Co-Housing Community. I had such an amazing experience interviewing the community members, talking to them on a personal level and as a group, and learning from their experiences. And it was something that will um, always be with me as I look forward to my years of aging gracefully. And just really wanted to say that all of the time that you provided me in the conversations was incredibly invaluable. And the resources, two books that I wanted just to mention here that were inspirations and really inspired the project, but also really framed the way that I had conversations with people at the community. The one on the left being from the Surgeon General. He was Obama's Surgeon General, and he is a doctor that has really uh, researched and documented the impacts of loneliness in our society. And the entire book together really talks about how loneliness impacts our health physically and mentally, and how in the health industry, it's not really talked about as much as it should be, because it does impact our everyday lives, and how learn to be within a strong close knit community can really delay those health effects and also promote a better way of aging gracefully. And then on the right is a book that started my research in senior co-housing, because he talks about it a lot in the book. And it's really a book that I think that everybody should read. It's really a conversation starter about how do we begin to talk about how the way we want to die, and how do we have those conversations with people that are in our lives that are really important, and how do we make sure that we honor and ensure that they die the way that they want to die. And usually people want to die in their own homes with their family surrounded them, but 70% of the American population does not it does not occur in that way. It's usually done in a hospital, because hospitals whole goals are to try to keep us alive as long as possible, but sometimes that's just really not what we really want. And then some web sources that are easily Googleable with regards to Senior Co-Housing, Foundation for Intentional Communities. Housing Learning and Improvement Network is or an organization that I was also introduced to by Patrick. And it's an organization that's a nonprofit that really helps connect people and organizations to current resources and research with regards to how do we solve our biggest problem of housing, of our housing crisis, and the lack of housing and the lack of affordable housing in the UK specifically for this organization, but also a lot of their solutions and research could be applied to the US. And Collaborative Housing and Innovative Care Project is a project that is also a research project out of the University of Bristol. And then Sage USA is a nonprofit organization that advocates, looks for services for the LGBTQ elders. And with that, I would like to share a video that was recorded by the researchers at the Collaborative Housing and Innovative Care Project regarding a lot of the research they did for senior co-housing and its impact on loneliness and isolation.
With a social care system in crisis, we urgently need to consider every innovation in housing, ageing and care that might help support us as we get older. Our study, Collaborative Housing and Innovative Practice in Social Care, explores the ways in which collaborative housing can help meet the changing care needs of older people. By collaborative housing, we mean a wide range of user-led, self-organised and community-orientated forms of housing. And when we talk about care, we mean not just formal social care, but also the wider practical, personal and emotional support provided formally or informally. Our research looked at 6 housing communities, which included co-housing, intentional communities with individual homes but also shared spaces and a commitment to community life. Some for older people only, others multi-generational. Senior housing co-ops, housing for social rent with on-site wardens. Self-managed retirement housing, also with a manager or warden on site. In total, we've interviewed more than 100 residents across the 6 communities to explore the benefits and challenges of growing older in collaborative housing. The most prominent finding from the research was that there are real benefits of living in collaborative housing in later life, and one key part of this is greater social interaction through housing design, organised activity, or the need to manage the scheme together.
I think the difference with living in the co-op is the community involvement. People help each other out.
If there's a problem, if there's an emergency, I know I can call on anybody, and that is a wonderful feeling to live with, that you know that there is a support there.
It proved itself when we had COVID and the lockdown, because we certainly embraced that as a community and managed to see each other and be apart, you know, and masks and all that sort of thing. But nevertheless, we had company.
We have bingo on a Monday, Tuesday we have bacon putty, Wednesday bingo, and then Thursday just a nice cup of tea. But you can go on a Friday if you want to, like it's always open for you. I made up, I love them all, they're great.
All the members have a vote to elect people onto a committee, and that committee is made up of 14 to 16 people at any one particular time who make decisions on behalf of all the residents on how and what needs to be done to keep the cooperative going. We appoint the contractors, we appoint the managing services, and anything that needs to be done.
It's the high degree of mutual support that makes collaborative housing strikingly different from living alone, with family, or in retirement housing. In different ways, each of the schemes makes it possible to age at home for longer, often delaying the need for a move into formal care settings. Living in collaborative housing also brings a strong sense of security and emotional support. It can be as simple as keeping an eye on whether your neighbour has put their blinds up in the morning, or having each other's allergy details or emergency contact details to hand.
Somebody's always there if there's an emergency. If you even just say, "Can anybody lend me a lemon?" Similarly, I'm there if anybody has an emergency. Little things like, today I've made too much soup, and so I've taken a bit of soup to someone who I know is not very well and would appreciate a bit more soup, you know.
I've got a neighbour at the moment who's off work next door to me who's had a hand operation, and I've been knocking on her when I've been going to the shops asking if she needs anything.
Well, I have been asked to rescue somebody breaking down the bathroom door where they're stuck in the bathroom. So I help wherever I can help.
You offer to help with the things you're good at, so I help out a bit with the maintenance tasks and a bit with the digital stuff, setting up Zoom calls and things like that. But I don't think of it as a role. It's just I can do some stuff, so I'm happy to help people, and likewise other people are happy to help us, look after the girls or bring our washing down, or put our bins out for us if we're in a rush in the morning. So we all just help each other out, really.
While creating a close and supportive community was a key aim, it's not intended in any of the schemes that members would become carers for each other. So it's important that limits are recognised, even if not written down as clear rules.
I think it's that point at which someone is beginning to not cope at home, which is the hardest thing. We in no way are set up to rescue each other. We won't do personal care, we won't put in your hearing aids, we won't change your bed sheets, but we will look after your cat if you go on holiday, we will do shopping if you're ill. And if it's time for somebody to go and be looked after more intensively, then I'm afraid that has to happen.
Where the boundary is where it becomes personal care that's needed. Helping them into bed, helping them out of bed, dressing them, toileting them. That's going to need professional care. We'll do their shopping, maybe help clean sometimes if they require that and they're not able to. Anything we can give in the way of ordinary neighbourly help.
On the other hand, each of the non-co-housing communities also have various levels of formal support built into their models, from on-site managers to communal services, with the costs shared by all residents. The managers, essentially employed by the residents themselves, are central figures in these schemes.
If anybody is in any difficulty, the first thing they think of is to phone for the manager. For anything really, not just on an emergency.
We're fortunate we have a manager who, although his brief is to be 9 to 5, but if there's an emergency or anything like that, and he lives on site, so that if there's any real emergency, he's usually there helping and assisting.
She phones you every morning between 9 and 9:30 just to make sure you're okay. If you don't answer, I've done it one time and you didn't hear it, and she'll come round, knock on the door to keep a check on you.
All the gardens are looked after. The same with the winter cleaners. They have their own winter cleaning service. So it's part of the tenancy, which is a good thing because they're not missing out on nothing then. All the gardens are lovely.
Alongside mutual support and paid services, families often still do play a key role. They tend to be the ones who help older residents make important decisions in relation to care, such as organising paid assistance and decisions on moving out of the community.
As far as family is concerned, I recently had a very serious fall in the corridor here and really wasn't able to look after myself, so my daughter moved in and she is still here, making sure that everything is fine.
Of course, the communities face many challenges, from the difficulty of attracting younger members to building informal arrangements for care, where these weren't included from the start.
The challenge is mostly to do with passing of time. We're all a lot older now than when we first moved in. We were an intergenerational community to begin with. We have been very lucky in that we got a new young family who did join us last year, and we've also got several younger lodgers and tenants who've recently moved in, which has helped to bring the average age down satisfyingly.
There have been ideas about building a room where there could be somebody, you know, a carer who would then go to different people. The idea of having someone in the house is a good one, and, you know, for less rent or no rent, that would be a good idea. None of us like to think we're going to be in that position, of course.
The various schemes that we've looked at here are maybe not for everyone. Co-housing in particular requires a high degree of social commitment, and none are intended as a substitute for properly funded and resourced social care. But we believe that the different models of collaborative housing that we've looked at allow people to remain socially connected, supported and in control of their lives for longer, especially in contrast with the options of staying put or moving into formal care that are often presented as the only choices.
If you've got total independence, total stability, and you've got people around, it's really not a bad arrangement for a retired person. I would recommend it.
Hey, and we're back. Thank you, Queena, for that very informative presentation on senior co-housing. Trevor, what do we have next?
Well, before we go to our next thing, we're going to have a special guest here from... Am I on camera? Okay, yes. From the Seattle Design Festival, our social media team is David.
Hey.
Hi, David.
Hey, what's up? Hi.
Hello.
Hi, everyone. My name is David. I'm the communications coordinator for Seattle Design Festival. Earlier today, we ran a contest on our Instagram where we were giving away one ticket for the closing party tomorrow. I'm going to say there was a lot of really cool answers in that question. But
name 4 of your favorites.
Name 4 of my favorites?
No.
I'm going to dox everyone like that. Anyways, we got to thinking, and I thought we were like, it's a little strange to just give away one. So instead, today we're going to give away 2 tickets. So let's do a random draw. All right, and our winners are D.Arkin and logofile_Solani. Cool.
Awesome.
Congrats, guys.
Congrats.
Cool.
I know one of those people.
Yeah, we will DM you with your promo codes to get to the closing party tomorrow. But congrats, guys.
And that's tomorrow night at Element Architects in their shop.
At the shop.
On First Ave, somewhere.
Cool. All right, well, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Cool.
We'll bring Adrian back here to talk about our next panel is from the Office of Planning and Community Development. Shout out to our friend Rico, who I think is in this next panel. They're going to be talking about the conversion of conversion of downtown office space into housing, which is a really interesting topic and a very complicated thing to do. So it's going to be a lot of real deep discussion and experts. I don't know. What do you think? You ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
Let's run
take it away.
Lyle Bicknell, a principal urban designer at the Seattle Office of Planning and Community Development.
Rico Quirindongo, Director of the Office of Planning and Community Development.
Corey Mathias, I'm a Senior Associate at the Miller Hole Partnership, and along with Claire, led the entry from the Miller Hole side, so I'll pass it to Claire now.
Hi, I'm Claire Runhack, Architect and Associate with the Miller Hole Partnership.
My name is Robert Humble. I'm a principal of hybrid architecture and happy to be involved.
I'm Case Creel. I'm a studio director and design manager at Gensler.
Welcome, everybody. As I mentioned before, this is a great panel. It's comprised of the 3 winners of our ideas contest on solutions of how we transform existing downtown office to residential. We had 14 entries. All of them were good, but the 3 finalists just gave us terrific work. And it's nice to have this brain trust together so that we can talk about our experience and our conclusions for the Seattle Design Festival. So with that, what I'm thinking we can do as part of this panel is I'll ask some just open questions, which everyone can jump in on. And then I'll ask some targeted questions specific to the three teams, kind of building on their specific recommendations and solutions. And then at the end of the program, we can talk about anything that people would like to build on or express as part of this whole process. With that, let's start. You know, the theme of this year's festival is curiosity. And I'm interested, really, from all the teams, as you investigated the office to residential design solutions, were there any surprises? Something that challenged your initial assumptions?
I think personally I was not surprised, but I was happy to see the breadth of different presentations and different approaches to buildings, and probably also maybe kind of what we learned, I feel, is that a lot of the projects were working with structures that were kind of pre-war, you could say. And it seems like in a lot of those cases, those were better candidates for this office to housing, which I think kind of seeing a number of different approaches to that, it kind of became clear specifically maybe why. So it was nice to kind of look at different teams approaching this generally the same problem, but with different solutions given the different buildings.
I think that's a common theme. One of the common themes that we heard looking at these 14 entries was that older buildings with more narrow footprints, not the typical larger footprints of our contemporary office tower stock, are more adaptable for a residential use because we can get light into the depth of that building envelope.
I'd jump in here with one kind of surprise from the Miller Hole team. I think, we had a really interesting opportunity to look at the building that we actually sit in every day as our case study. And at least personally, I've begun to see this building in kind of a new way and picture the evolution of this project, long after we're sort of gone, right? That this building can have many generations of sort of useful urban fabric in it, and it can continue to contribute and evolve even as economies and situations within the city change. So that's been a really cool aspect to sort of realize through this process.
Corey, that leads us quite well to the specific question that I was going to ask of you and Claire. Your solution proposed combining office and residential in one structure. What are the advantages and disadvantages of that kind of solution?
I can speak a little bit to that, Corey, and feel free to chime in here if I miss anything. But I think one thing that Corey mentioned is our project is the building in which we're sited, and our firm is located in Pioneer Square, which has a really vibrant mix of uses, businesses, residences, retail, and different scales of uses. One really interesting aspect of incorporating offices, retail, and residential into one project is we were seeing this project or proposal as a microcosm of Pioneer Square and what makes it so vibrant and active. So thinking about how we could bring in different uses into a singular building and create that microcosm of a community inside our existing walls was really compelling to us.
Yeah, and it kind of speaks to the notion that buildings don't have to be defined by a single use. They don't have to remain static over time. They can sort of ebb and flow and hopefully be adaptable enough to remain relevant. So that was sort of the fundamental premise of our proposal.
Are there some specific challenges when you do that kind of multi-function building that makes it a bit more difficult?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we wrestled with the core configuration and how to, provide some privacy and separation between uses, but also try and find, common, benefit to the cores for both. So I think we went through a few iterations on cores. Some tried to maintain what was here. Ultimately, we decided that in order to sort of appropriately serve both uses, we needed to introduce new cores.
I really love that notion of a building ebbing and flowing, because that's so much as to how a neighborhood works. When you're looking at something at a larger scale, but really our codes are not set up for ebbing and flowing. They're set up for a single moment in time when you make a decision as to what use to call that building. So if there are ways in which we can relax, the code's ability to fix in time, what a building should be, I think that will help it become something a little bit more alive and less static.
I think maybe to add to that, I think what was really interesting about the building that we work with, the Mutual Life building in Pioneer Square, is, after really doing some research on the building, it has already changed many times over its life. It was originally built as a single-story building in a depressed economy. They came back, that was in 1890. They came back 5 or 6 years later and added 5 stories to the building. And it was primarily offices for the first 60 years of its life until about 1960, when they converted it from offices to studio apartments. And then in 1980, 20 years later, they came back and did some additions to the core and some seismic upgrades and converted it from housing back to office. And now here we are 40 years later, looking about going from office back to housing. So I just think that's a great kind of case study. We kind of think about, buildings history and kind of are fixed in time and the way we are viewing it today. But I think if you really look back through the life of these buildings, they've already lived many, many lives in the future. And I think any intervention that we do should encourage, the progression of these many lives moving forward from past to present to future. So I think that it was really kind of nice of kind of understanding the building's past, where it is in the present, and then setting up in a way that I'm under no presumption that any changes to this building is going to be static and it's going to be around 20, 30, 40 years ago or from now. It's in all probability, it's not just a likelihood, it's very probable it's going to change in some way again in the future that maybe we cannot anticipate. And even thinking about, certainly over the last 3 years, how we occupy and use our housing, how we occupy and use our offices, with Zoom calls, what we're doing here today, and people working from home and working remotely. I think there's a real blurring of the boundaries between a place to work and a place to live. And that's a very contemporary phenomena that I think is very, very important to kind of address, at least in this point in time, how to kind of work on these transformations of these building infrastructure we have.
You know, we talked earlier about how pre-war buildings lend themselves a bit easier to that kind of flexibility and change. Post-war, harder, and in fact, it was telling. Most of the entries were adaptive reuse for pre-1940s building. An important exception was one of the winners, and that was Gensler, which chose to examine a 1960s era building, which has its own challenges. Specifically, as architects say, the fenestration is non-operable, or everyone else says you can't open the windows. That's an issue. It's kind of a different one, but obviously in a lot of buildings of that era and later, changing out the fenestration can be just prohibitively expensive. I'd like to hear your thoughts, Case, on kind of that you're thinking there. How do we really make these post-war buildings livable?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I'll admit that we had to obscure our building a little bit at the request of the owner. And the building that we were actually looking at has punched openings, operable windows that were fixed in time at one point in time when someone came in and screwed them shut. But, you know, this building would have been very easily, converted in that respect from an envelope perspective. Going forward, if we were to take a look at a newer building, that's certainly a challenge. It's not unreasonable for people who live downtown to want to have natural ventilation, and so to do that really does require a much greater expense. And so when we are looking at this, looking at the call for ideas, certainly finding ways to offset the costs, that we know are associated with these conversions, was really important to us. Are there things that could be done to mitigate the costs, in particular, that are going to be imposed by the existing building code? Certainly, a lot of them are necessary to keep people safe. We're not arguing that seismic considerations should be ignored. They certainly shouldn't. But are there ways in which you can, we can find common ground with the need to bring these buildings, up to date and the need to have them occupied? That was a big push on our part.
Big challenges, absolutely. Robert, the judges for this process were, the panel of our judges was particularly impressed by the innovative thinking that your team did with unit and unit configurations, proposing such things as co-living, I think is what you called it, where you would have a number of the functions of a residential unit shared in common, which was a great way to get at affordability, given that not every unit would have to have all the amenities, and that a lot of the function could happen elsewhere in a shared way. The co-living idea is a terrific one, and I'd love to see it replicated. One question I have for you is, in your model, at least typically co-living is a group of people who've agreed to live together. Could you see this model applying to folks who are just looking for an inexpensive place to live?
Sure. I mean, I could give a little of my personal history. I moved here, after college 30 years ago, and with no job. I'd never moved up to Seattle sight unseen, and I moved into a share house in Capitol Hill that was an old 4-story structure that had been broken into kind of 2 apartments with 2 kitchens and I think a total of 12 bedrooms. And I had 11 roommates, and I think a total of 3 or 4 bathrooms and a couple of kitchens that we shared. And at that time in my life, it was great. I met a lot of people. Not everybody was my age, but a lot of them were, and a lot of them were very transitory. Some of them, I ended up staying for almost 3 years there because I enjoyed it. And I think, our office is involved in any number of housing types, and they're kind of getting smaller and smaller, from a C2 apartment that has its own little kitchen, its own little bath, doesn't really have a whole lot of room to live in, but it's self-contained, to a congregate residence, which supposedly, as the name implied, is about the congregate part of it, but I think they also live very kind of self-contained. And the congregate spaces, it can be difficult for people to actually use them. So I think, really one primary strategy that we had, number one, was to reduce the amount of penetrations through the floor plate or through the existing building. So by kind of ganging our plumbing, we reduced the number of bathrooms in the project. We gang a little maybe kitchenette behind a plumbing wall for a bathroom, and they could share that stack. But also it's kind of a middle ground. I mean, really what we wanted to see was, there was a time when the most affordable housing in Seattle was SROs, or single room occupancies, which were primarily in Pioneer Square. And those have gone out of favor and are illegal, I would feel, in most cases right now, to replicate that model, and probably rightly so. They're not the most livable. But we kind of took that as inspiration. How can we kind of create an SRO housing for this new generation that's incorporating new ideas of community and new ideas of living together? And I think in a lot of, we actually are doing co-housing projects in the city of Seattle and in Germany right now. And I think it's a real emerging thing. And I think, and frankly, the call for ideas and entries was very clear. They wanted to look at different ways of looking at housing. So if we're going to ever enter any kind of competition, why are we entering? Are we entering to get some ideas out there? Are we entering to create some cool graphics? No, we're entering to win. So if we're going to win, we're going to follow the rules. So we did a couple of case studies of creating, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom and urban 1-bedroom apartments in here. But we've got thousands of those unit types being created throughout this city. I don't think we need any more of those unit types. I think we need to be exploring truly affordable housing in this city, because there's multiple crises that the city is confronted with. Obviously, it's a housing and affordability go hand in hand. The Pioneer Square in particular has seen better decades, and the fact that there's a lot of this building that we chose, we walked through it. I mean, it is primarily empty. There was probably a time in the 80s when they did that remodel. It was kind of built for lawyers, but lawyers are not in there now. So that, once again, is kind of is a resource, not only from the building, but for the neighborhood, that we feel bringing the density and some new residents in it at an affordable price is kind of killing two birds with one stone.
Robert, I had a question because I thought that your proposal was particularly intriguing. Your congregate residences and the small efficiency dwelling units hover around 200 square feet and around 1,000 to 1,200 a month. Do you think that those would be competitive in the market given their size?
Do you mean the congregate or the small efficiency dwellings?
Either or both.
I think the co-living model, because they basically are, I think because they're sharing a bathroom, that you actually have more livable space. And there are a client of ours that has recently developed a co-living model where basically people that don't know each other, maybe 2 or 3 people, share the same bath. And we kind of laid out the units in a way that you'd have clusters of 2 to 3 bedrooms. You'd kind of enter, for lack of a better term, a cluster, a little apartment through a door, but the bathroom was accessed not internally through an individual's dwelling, but through a hallway. And what that allows is basically for bathrooms to be cleaned by a third party. So this goes a long way. This is the way these things typically operate, is that there's a service that comes in and cleans the bathroom and cleans the co-living space. So we wanted to kind of allow for that. I think that's kind of where a lot of the friction, frankly, comes from co-living. Certainly 30 years ago, when I was living, with 11 roommates, most of the friction was about someone leaving their dirty dishes in the sink or the dirty towel on the bathroom floor. So I think we're trying to find an opportunity to kind of find a middle ground there. And I do think these units could be, once again, competitively priced with congregate residents and small efficiency dwelling units, frankly. I mean, we were pushing to try to get the price down as low as possible. And I think a lot of that has to do with really basically the amount of upgrades to the building. The nice thing about our building, it already had operable windows. It actually had, in the 80s, they added a second stair, so it actually met exiting just the way it is. It had some structural upgrades also in the 80s. Whether those would meet today's standards or not would be a good question for a structural engineer. But I think the basic infrastructure was really there. So if we talk about improvements to the building, it's energy efficiency, it's seismic upgrades. These are obviously very, very important things. But kind of, if we have to make some compromises, where can compromises be made to find middle ground?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to the co-housing discussion. And one of the things that we found is that in post-war buildings, the depth of the floor plate oftentimes is one of those drawbacks to typical current unit planning, and the co-living model is one way to address that. When we've taken a look at newer buildings, whether they're Class A, B, or C, post-war, the floor plates tend to be much deeper, and I think the reasons for that have long been bandied about. But the co-housing, co-living model does solve that, in a lot of different ways. You can shorten up the unit depth for those areas that are private, that really do want to have access to windows, and some of the portions that can be held in common can occupy that zone closer to the core, and maybe within the core where you might have existing bathrooms to take advantage of plumbing. I know Robert's solution looked at a lot of that, but I think it can be adapted to newer buildings as well. The trick would be to find a building that has a price point, a more recent Class B building or Class C building that could accommodate that.
This raises the big question that unless you're looking at some smart co-housing proposal like Robert suggested, the kind of units that we naturally produce through these conversions tend to be very high end, just by the nature of the costs. And we've learned from other jurisdictions all over the country that the way to get to affordability is basically through government subsidy, somehow incentivizing affordability. I'd love to hear just everyone's thoughts on what's the best way to incentivize. Is that straight dollars? Is it, what way can government, if we are choosing to subsidize, what can be the most effective way to get there?
Part of our decision to mix both uses and sort of income level of residential units was to help subsidize within the project itself. So by keeping two levels of commercial office space in our pro forma, those were generating higher revenue and actually helping to offset the 3 floors of workforce housing. Then we took all of the area that was displaced by the introduction of the courtyard into that mass and introduced it as sort of high-end luxury units around the top of the building. So through the mixture of those program elements, we were starting to sort of subsidize within the project. That doesn't get to the policy question of what government can do, but that was sort of how we approached it from an architectural perspective.
Maybe tackling on to Corey's response in terms of what government could do or what the city could do. We looked a lot to other cities and municipalities who are doing similar things or looking at office to residential conversions also. I think California is doing an opportunity zone in downtown cores to attract investor money that would look at this type of conversion. That was something we proposed that we could look at as the city of Seattle. I think also we looked at Calgary and their downtown development incentive program where you could provide a grant specifically for office to resi conversions. Also, any sort of speed to market, streamlining of the entitlement process, something that would really save down on the entitlement costs and the scheduling costs, really time being money, are things that could attract developers to take on these type of projects. So we came at this from twofold, much framed out by Rico and the city's challenge is to really look at it as a policy perspective, but also to look at architecturally what we could do to help address this.
Well, I think, in addition to the solutions that Claire noted, one of the things that we were looking at was how to get more certainty up front in a process, in the project process. When you're dealing with a commercial TI, you know exactly what your scope is going to be right away. You've got a building code that you can work against, and there are no surprises. And certainly with the existing building code, that's something that terrifies almost every developer who would undertake one of these, because you don't know until you invest in an awful lot of money what the scope of your project is. So trying to get more certainty on these projects earlier on, I think would be really, really helpful. And again, it's just not to remove the safety concerns behind the existing building code, but when you're dealing with a commercial TI, you're dealing oftentimes with far more people who are going to spend a lot longer time in these buildings. I think to me that there should be some recognition that the building does not change all of a sudden, even though you change the use of it. Though I recognize that it's an opportunity for taking advantage of an opportunity to upgrade the building. But if you could treat them more like TIs, both in speed and in consistency of the application of the code, I think you would tend to get more of these happening. That in and of itself won't change the cost. The costs are still going to be a challenge, but I think you sort of have to look in multiple places for ways to get at this.
Excellent. I've got one final question for the collective panel. Proximity to work used to be the big draw for living downtown, and that's not quite the case anymore. Downtown has to provide other things if we're going to encourage to move into these great buildings that you all have proposed. I'd love to get the whole panel's thoughts on what are some of the things the city should be doing, others should be doing to promote the desirability of wanting to live downtown as we add more residential units in our core.
I think a lot of it has already happened. I think we've kind of laid the infrastructure over the last 10 to 20 years with building out mass transit, which reduces the need for individual car ownership, which in a lot of these older buildings, at least in ours, didn't have parking. Obviously, there's just technological changes. If you needed to get a ride share or something to go out to Mount Rainier one day, you can rent a car by the day. Obviously, in case of Pioneer Square, in a big swath of downtown, with the removal of the viaduct, it's a much more pleasant place to be. I guess I think downtown living is always going to be an attractive place for a certain segment of the population, but maybe not everybody. I think really what is missing and we could work on moving forward is how can we get more families downtown. I think a lot of the new housing we create and a lot of the people that are living in more of the urban areas are generally younger people, and at some point those people are going to choose to have a family, and downtown doesn't really have a much housing stock that encourages that. But I think another really important thing to talk about is what is the definition of family? I think we talk about family in our mind is not this nuclear family with mom and dad and 2 kids. There's a lot of different families now that could be a couple of friends that choose to cohabitate are a family. You could have an elderly person and a caretaker, or a family. You have, single parents. That's a family. So I think a lot of times we just think about this family in a very kind of outdated mode, and how can we kind of encourage housing for families of all types in our downtown areas moving forward.
The jury, Claire, I was just going to say the jury was really impressed with your work and Miller Hull's proposal, in that it actually demonstrated a strategy for how you could grow a unit as the units change, or as the needs change. And that was really impressive, because it is hard, as everyone knows, to get affordable 3-unit or 3-bedroom units, and the idea that you could have something that would grow to meet the needs was a compelling part of Miller Hull's project.
Yeah, just thinking about what Robert said in reflection to the JCFO plan and the revitalization of the waterfront, I think going back to the original question is, how can we think about attracting people back to downtown? Yes, for sure, programming, enlivening the downtown, bringing a sense of vibrancy back, I think is done through activity and programming. And you're seeing a lot of that now on the waterfront, or even some in the Denny Triangle, whether it's through DSA or through private enterprises like Amazon is doing in the Denny Triangle. I think a lot of that really does help bring back programming for a multitude of different people and communities. So imagining just 10 years ago that seeing the JCFO plans for the waterfront and not being able to imagine that being a reality. And then with our building, the Polson building, being located right in Pioneer Square next to Coleman Dock, being part of that process, seeing the viaduct come down, the reorganization of the streets, the planting and the reconnection to the waterfront, I think that has really reinvigorated this perimeter of Seattle. And I'm hoping that we can think about ways to do that in the downtown core as well. I mean, to address your second question about family programming and Robert's point that families can look a lot of different ways these days. Part of our proposal with the cellular structure, the nature of inserting a cellular grid into the existing heavy timber structure of the 1906 warehouse, is the idea that we're forming these units that are all very similar and modular, but that throughout time they could connect, be locked together to address growing needs, multiple bedrooms, intergenerational living, but adding some sort of flexibilities for units to grow and take on adjacent units and become larger, or to flex back down to accommodate the different needs of that particular population. Corey, I don't know if you want to add anything on to that.
No, that was a great description. I think it again just kind of reinforces our desire to look at like a long-term evolution of this building, and the idea that units can sort of aggregate and connect in really interesting spatial configurations too is very exciting as a sort of architectural concept. So
yeah, we studied a bit about how units could kind of multiply or join with their adjacent units on the same floor, but also how they could start punching up or punching down through levels, so you could expand vertically as well as horizontally. And I think our particular building, because of its heavy timber structure on a specific grid, really accommodated itself to that type of growth.
And then long term, I know we need to have a higher population to support it, but of course, there's always a long-term conversation about a downtown school, or at least a school that's a little bit closer to the downtown. But rather than considering this as a new building, is this another opportunity for reuse? I think what we know is that learning environments look an awful lot more like offices these days. So is that another opportunity for us to engage in adaptive reuse, to engage in opportunities to revitalize the downtown? So that may be some time off, but may not be that far off.
We limited this discussion to conversion to residential, but conversion to biotech, conversion to university use, conversion even to elementary school. Those are great options too, because they help the health of the downtown as well. I'm going to end it here at this point. I'd love to, if anyone had something they wanted to say and they didn't say it, or have any other thoughts, I'd love to hear them. I'd love to hear them now.
I think we'd just like to thank the city for opening this competition up. Miller Hull's firm is really rooted in curiosity and considering the bigger questions that affect our community, and we love to work in this type of speculative conceptual realm. So having the opportunity to do something like that so close to our hearts and so close to our city was a really great opportunity. So thank you, Rico and Lyle.
Of course, we've been in a conversation with multiple cities across the nation about the revitalization of our downtowns, and one of those components was this office to residential discussion, and internally in our office we really got inspired by the idea of, well, let's stop arm waving about this subject and let's have a real brass tacks discussion about what might be possible. So I would say that we are really indebted to everybody who participated in the competition, and very thankful to your three firms, Hybrid, Gensler, and Miller Hull, for your really beautiful, innovative ideas and prospective solutions. I'm super excited for the city to support those, both the ideas and the actual projects that have been proposed, knowing that probably only a handful of them will happen. But I think it's really inspirational as we look at new ways of living, new ways of occupying space, how to make our downtown streets more vibrant. I think that you have presented a bunch of great ideas here, and very timely. And I would say to the audience watching, we're the cities in the Office of Planning and Community Development is leading the effort for our comprehensive plan major update. So our One Seattle plan. Please do get involved. Know that our contemplation regarding missing middle housing and providing housing for people at all levels, that's something that we're spending a lot of time looking at our how our city policies can support the city as we continue to grow and evolve. So thank you all for your participation.
I guess if I have a closing thought, it's I think that it's kind of a time for big ideas. We're involved in a lot of market rate housing in the city and have been in the last 10 years or so, and those projects have more or less stopped over the last year and a half because of the cost of construction, cost of lending, and what the market rate housing developers will say is they're not going to start again till interest rates come down and rents go up. So that to me is just not an encouraging sign that we've kind of put a pause in a big way of the creation of housing over the last couple of years. And the only thing that's going to get it going again, at least that you'd have any control over, is rents. So I think we have a very over the last 30 years I've lived here, the city's demographic has changed substantially. And over the last 3 years, our big tech employers have been laying people off and not hiring. And I could just see a not too distant future when this storm blows over in a year or two, whenever it is, that these companies are going to be hiring again, rents are going to be going up again, cost of construction is likely not going to be going down, and we're going to be in a bigger crisis than we are now. I think it's always been the economic slow times when people can kind of sit back and have the time and resources to really think deeply about this in retrospect of what led us to this point. So how can we lay the groundwork for the next 10-year expansion if that's what it is, and to do it now. You know, it's a cycle, and we're at the bottom of a cycle, and we're going to come back out of it, and it's going to cycle up again. So the decisions we're making today are going to greatly impact the capacity for new housing in the city during the next cycle.
That's a great call to arms to end on. I think that was a great discussion. Really appreciate everyone's insight, conversation. This has been a real pleasure, and I look forward to seeing the final run.
Hey, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that panel from the Office of Planning and Community Development. I know I did when I watched it the first time. What do we have to say, Adrian?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for tuning in to today's show. And if you tuned into the previous shows, thank you for that too. It's been a good time putting this together this year. Yeah, we hope to see you next year.
Yeah, and we do want to thank Seattle Architecture Foundation. In fact, we're going to bring on the interim executive director. I think I gave you her right name.
Hi.
Hannah, who maybe you could say hello.
Yeah, it's so great to be here. And we just had an excellent mixer event here at the Center for Architecture and Design. It was super exciting to be part of the virtual Mainstage for a moment.
Yes. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. And one of the things I learned today in thinking about tonight was that our first partnership was in 1998 for something called AIA Seattle's Architecture Week.
Yeah, the precursor to the festival.
Which is so fascinating. Anyway, so long partnership.
Yes, and then you said right now you've got the model exhibit going on, which is in its second decade or third decade.
26th year, which is pretty amazing. Yeah.
And then can people check that out all week?
Absolutely.
All month, I think.
So it's online.
Okay.
And it closes. It'll be open till September 2nd, or sorry, 7th. So you can come to the windows.
Okay.
Or make an appointment, or come to one of our events.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you, Hannah. I appreciate it.
Thanks
We're
so
going
much.
to bring Adrian back for our last little note here. So, thank you. So this wraps up the virtual main stage for this year. I don't know if Adrian did all the work, so we should everybody thank Adrian. There's probably applause. Adrian, do you have anything to say? What did you learn from this year's program?
What did I learn? Quite a bit, actually. Taking on, coordinating with a lot of people to make this happen. A lot of volunteers, which we're very thankful for, as from all the way down to making their own videos, just using their phones, to editing, to graphics. All across the board, it's been nice to bring people together in this way.
Yeah, it's been great. I mean, I appreciate each day we've had something really fun. I mean, we'd love to have the Future Arts. Ashwin telling us about board games. There's been a real kind of spread of things here, from the very in-depth to the very creative. It's all been something to be curious about.
Ooh, I like that. And on that note,
yes. Well, we should say there's a closing party tomorrow night for anybody watching live. Please check out cdesignfest.org for more info there. Adrian and I are doing a cool event on Friday called the Sam Remix. Come see us there. There's some festival things happening. And I think that's all we have to say. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.